humanities, and technological development. So we consider historical, philosophical, sociological, psychological implication of technological innovation in a broad sense. And so I would go on, let me see if I can change the slide. So I want to thank our partners and sponsors, especially the Michigan Humanities Council that generously offered a grant to us in order to sponsor some of our initiatives. But we have very nice partnerships also within Lawrence Tech. Many of the colleges, especially the College of Art and Science and the College of Architecture and Design, really collaborate in the effort of putting together an excellent roster of speakers. Then also the collaboration with the Mark Burger STEM Center, the Teagle Foundation, the Southfield Public Library, and the HHMI, the Ours Views Medical Institute. They are really important contributors to our initiative. I will just introduce the next meeting, which will be December 1st. And it's a very fascinating talk about the complex history of computing. And in particular, it's going to be a story and a narration of the fact that the history of computing is not only an happy story of success and progress, but it has a lot of kind of side less happy implications, especially in terms of gender and in terms of labor. So I really invite you to be with us 1st of December for this wonderful talk. And before giving the stage to Paul, that is going to introduce our speaker of today, I would like to remind you that this meeting is recorded. So if you want to, if you still want to have your camera on, just be aware that your image will be recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, just turn on your video and your camera, and then you will not be visible in the recording. So that being said, I give the stage to Paul for introducing the today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Franco. If you could go to the next slide, I believe I have her talk poster up. There we are. And thank you all for being here today. In her book, Playing Nature, Dr. Alenda Chang begins by noting that Henry David Thoreau's Walden has been converted into a video game. But she assures us, quote, "This is not as heretical as it sounds." Indeed, I would say it is not. Walden is an essential text of American nature writing, documenting Thoreau's decision to pursue a rustic, self-reliant life. But it is also a work profoundly engaged with the relationship between medium and meditation, representation and identity, technologies of survival, and our dependence on our ecology. In this way, I see Walden as one instance in a long history of human productions designed to help us see and experience the non-human world, a tradition that extends from the cave paintings of Lascaux to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, from mythic stories of the Garden of Eden to romantic poets versifying the sublime. Video games, Dr. Chang argues, provide a new arena for this mediation of the human and the non-human, combining representation and narrative with interactivity and speculative world making. Through this synthesis of technology and nature, gaming can contribute to new modes of relation to the non-human world. Given the ongoing damage caused by our current extractive exploitation of our environment, those new forms of relationship are desperately needed. Dr. Chang is an associate professor of film and media studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is the founding co-editor of a new University of California Press open access journal, Media and Environment. And at UC Santa Barbara, she co-directs Wireframe, a media studio that promotes collaborative theoretical and creative media practice with investments in global science, global social and environmental justice. Her humanity and technology lecture today is entitled Finding Nature in the Games We Play. I wish we were in a big space where we can give her a round of applause, but please join me and offering her a hearty Zoom welcome. Dr. Chang, I'll turn over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I am, well, let me just first say thank you to everybody who's here today and attending, and still has energy and is not totally consumed by election anxiety. I'm really happy I can provide, an hour and a half of distraction from all of that. But take heart and, take some satisfaction in the just sheer number of votes that have happened so far. I'm really ecstatic about that. No matter all the rest is very stressful. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share screen, and you can hear me just fine. Okay. All right. Oops. There we go. Okay. So you're here for Finding Nature in the Games We Play. And I wanted to kind of extend my thanks to all of you, especially to Paul Jawson and Franco, Julia, Scott, and everyone else who's toiling behind the scenes to make all of this possible. And I just think this series, it just, first of all, just looks great. The speakers that have been through and that are coming through are amazing. And it's just a wonderful gift for your campus community at a time like this when we're all so atomized and looking for ways to reconnect and sort of remember the joys of learning. So this is great. I'm really happy to be part of it, to connect to people that are not just my immediate family members. And I was really ecstatic to hear that I might be speaking to the next generation of designers and engineers and artists and product managers, critics, and on and on. So it's really great to have all of you here. I know it can be really hard to follow Zoom lectures of any length, so I just want to start by giving you an outline of the structure of the talk. So there will be roughly 2 sections. So first, I want to start with a slightly longer discussion of what it means to talk about ecology in games. And I mean by that some of the ways that environmental science and philosophy can help us to think about game content and game form. Then, in a slightly shorter but equally important discussion of the ecology of games rather than the ecology in games, I want to zoom way out to think about the media ecosystems and the real ecosystems of which games are a part. So this entails thinking about the games industry, its sourcing and disposal practices, and the sustainability of players' energy demands. But to begin, as Paul mentioned, I wanted to start with a game called Walden, which is based on one of the most famous pieces of nature writing by the American transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau. So nearly 200 years ago now, Thoreau, who lived in Concord, Massachusetts, decided to strike out on his own and leave the comforts and constraints of civilization behind by living on his own for 2 years on the shores of Walden Pond. And it's from Thoreau that we get such memorable quotes as, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, and in wildness is the preservation of the world. As a transcendentalist, Thoreau believed in the spiritually uplifting powers of nature and the corrupting influences of society. And his experiment in living, I guess what we would call off the grid these days, at Walden was an attempt to shed the latter and find the former through self-reliance, simplicity, and quiet contemplation. Generations of nature lovers and wilderness enthusiasts have taken Thoreau's teachings to heart. So it may have come as a shock to many when Professor Tracy Fullerton and her team at USC decided to turn Walden into a video game with the help of funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and other sources. And I say a shock because at first glance, the principles of nature communion and simple labor embodied in Thoreau's years at the pond seem like the polar opposite of a virtual experience in nature, mediated by keyboard taps, mouse clicks, or controller buttons and sticks. Called the world's most improbable video game by Smithsonian Magazine, the Walden game actually went on to be the winner of Game of the Year at the 2017 Games for Change Festival, and Best Overall Game at the 2018 Intentional Play Summit, and other outlets have dubbed it the most Zen game ever. But before I continue, let me just play you a little bit of this, and then I'll mute it so I can keep talking.
When I wrote the following pages, or rather the bulk of them, I lived alone in the woods, a mile from any neighbor, in a house which I had built myself, on the shore of Walden Pond, in Concord, Massachusetts, and earned my living by the labor of my hands only.
So I'll let this play in the background. Hopefully it won't be too distracting. So things get more complicated when you actually play Walden. Often lumped into the category of walking simulator or first-person walker game, Walden doesn't offer much to the stereotypical hardcore gamer who is looking for something to fight or shoot, or a sophisticated blend of puzzles and reflex-based gameplay. In Walden the game, you do largely as Thoreau did in the seasons from late March 1845 to September 1847. Build and maintain a one-room cabin, forage and fish for food, plant and tend beans, lots of beans, survey the surrounding countryside, and spend hours lost in reading, writing, and thinking. And one thing that I love about the game is that they actually eschew the sort of romantic experiment of Walden by making it clear that Thoreau actually did go to the town of Concord quite a bit and visit his buddy Emerson. That's not Emerson, that's the shopkeeper. And got free pies and laundry service from his mom. And you can't die in the Walden game. You can pass out from doing too much manual labor, but you can't die. And in one of the most interesting mechanics of the game, time spent reading or observing nature literally changes your worldview, turning the sky and surrounding trees a rosier color, while working for wages drains the graphics of these golden tints and turns your outlook drab and gray. Furthermore, Fullerton herself had read and loved Thoreau as a child and hoped that the game would lead younger people less likely to discover the work these days to the text. Fullerton and her students at the Game Innovation Lab at USC also didn't just rely on themselves for game development. They consulted academics, historians, and experts on Thoreau's life and philosophies at the Huntington Library at LA and the Walden Woods Project in Massachusetts. So Walden lets me make the point, or make several points actually, about games and their relationship to the environment, which is part of the reason I start my book and end my book playing nature with it. First, game developers aren't just drawing inspiration from other games. To me, that seems far too limiting for any creative form. Just like poets, artists, musicians, and so on, game designers can and do take inspiration from the world around them. Another game that I love to talk about, called Firewatch, was developed by a small studio, Campo Santo, which has since been acquired. And it takes place in the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. And what I love about this game is not just the game itself, but it's the research process. It's the fact that Campo Santo developers actually went on camping trips to better nail the feel of the national parklands shown in the game. And that Jane Ang, who's in the red jacket there, the game's lead environment artist, actually dug into US Forest Service archives to get the look of the fire towers and so on in the game just right. So second, games are not and have never been monolithically one thing, although you might get that sense if you're a non-gamer looking in, or someone who plays almost exclusively one genre or style of game, whether it's first-person shooters, action adventures, or casual games. I started with Walden and walking simulators that are likely to irritate many people who wouldn't consider these real games, because I think we are all better served by imagining and encouraging many different kinds of games. games where all you do is walk around and look at things carefully, games where you take a more omniscient view and try to manage a system, games where you compete or try to achieve goals with or against other players, and so on and so on. Now, for me, the pandemic has really brought this into perspective. As many of us are feeling increasingly trapped in our homes by the need to limit the circulation of the coronavirus, I've kind of been keeping track of what seems like a definite uptick of people playing games, but also a surge of journalistic interest in how we use games as a way of escaping cramped reality or getting outdoors without actually going out. As a case in point, take the game Animal Crossing: New Horizons, which is just the latest installment in a long-running series for Nintendo, but seems to have hit a cultural nerve. And so I just kind of grabbed a sample of some of the articles that have come across my feed. So here's the New York Times saying Animal Crossing is the game for the coronavirus moment. Here's another one about a little bit more personal about how Animal Crossing and virtual gardening have kept the author sane during the pandemic. And then this one about, well, couldn't have an in-person wedding, so we held it in Animal Crossing. Of course, there's no way Nintendo could have known that this game, which basically tasks the player with turning a deserted island into a tight-knit communal paradise for a small group of animal friends, would drop at exactly the moment when most of the world was waking up to the reality of the coronavirus and lockdowns in March of this year. But the timing was not lost on Nintendo fans. Even a really cursory web search reveals scores of these articles about how Animal Crossing fits the demands of the moment. And as of June 30th, when Nintendo released its latest financial data, you can see that the company's net profit is up over 500%, and that Animal Crossing: New Horizons is on track to become the best-selling game on Nintendo Switch. Okay, by May, when I tried to buy a Switch for my brother for a big birthday milestone, I was feeling really lucky that I had bought my own Switch back in 2018 before the pandemic made it almost impossible to get one. And this is a quick screen grab I took just a couple of days ago of the latest price gouging by third-party sellers on Amazon for the Nintendo Switch console, which has an MSRP of $299.99. And these prices aren't even the worst that I've seen, honestly. So as with Walden, it would be pretty easy to level a critique at Animal Crossing, that it's a classic example of what Raymond Williams called mobile privatization, or the ability to look out on the world from the safety and comfort of one's home or car. Or we could follow the lead of the game designer and Georgia Tech professor Ian Bogost, who many years ago observed that Animal Crossing games were basically thinly veiled capitalism simulations, because you're pushed to constantly take out ever larger mortgages, from the totally sus raccoon Tom Nook to upgrade your house, build infrastructure, and shop for the best items to decorate your island. But I think in many ways that would be missing the point. For many people, myself included, there was real relief in discovering and making my island feel like home. There was joy in learning about all the insects, fish, and plant species, watching falling stars on clear nights, and swimming in the moonlit waters. And while Animal Crossing: New Horizons might be the poster child of the pandemic gaming movement, it's far from the only game that the digitally savvy are making and playing to battle the anxiety of confinement. Melissa Kagan, who incidentally is now one of the editors of the Journal of Gaming and Virtual Worlds, wrote a piece for The Guardian about the rest and relaxation offered by walking in games, and highlighted games like Walden and Adam Robinson Hughes' A Short Hike, which is pictured here. And I just played this a little bit with my son the other day. I haven't finished it, but it's a really cute game which starts with this kind of nuclear bird family going for a car trip to the great outdoors. And it starts with this teenager protagonist waking up and being horrified at the lack of cell service and having to go on this quest to the mountaintop to get cell service. Others have looked to VR, which for various reasons I'm a little more skeptical about, and maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. Here, this author draws attention to the VR modules designed by a 3D environment artist from West Australia, including this one. Not too choppy. So this one is of the Wakamarina Valley. I'm probably murdering that, in New Zealand. And you can see here that there's a sort of built-in sub-game of photography where you can capture images of the virtual environment as you explore it. And this artist has also done other modules for Castle Rock Beach in West Australia, the Fushimi Inari Shrine in Kyoto, Japan, and the southern coast of Iceland. And by the way, if any of you are gamers and happen to purchase the bundle for racial justice and equality, which was available at a steep discount earlier this year on itch.io and Steam, the New Zealand module that I'm showing you and the game that I showed you, A Short Hike, are both included in the roughly 1,700 titles in that game. Okay. So these are the kinds of digital experiences and games that I write about in my work all the time. And they are ones which, frankly, kind of make you scratch your head or raise an eyebrow as you try to work out all the apparent contradictions. If I could see your faces right now, I don't have them up on my screen. I would guess that many of you are probably thinking, wait a second, she's trying to tell me that I can experience nature from my couch. And trust me, I get that. But having spent a good chunk of my life trying to bridge the sciences and the humanities and thinking about how nature, in kind of scare quotes, both exists out there and is constructed by and through culture, I no longer think there's an easy dividing line between the virtual and the real, or between nature and us. And so, I recognize that environmental educators are deeply and rightfully suspicious of electronics and all the fancy doodads that take kids' attention away from their lived environments. I also get that a lot of people still associate games and the people who play them with antisocial basement or man cave dwelling nerds with poor social skills. And I hope you recognize this image from a very famous South Park episode about World of Warcraft. Unfortunately, I don't have time to unpack all of those stereotypes right now, but we could talk about that in Q&A. But I just want to say that, as with most generalizations, there's some kernel of truth to them, even as the generalizations fail to capture the real diversity. And when I set out about 10 years ago to write about ecology and environments and games, it was really driven by a sense that we weren't having important and necessary conversations about games and how they intersect with the wider world. Games aren't just texts with player contexts, because they're also connected to larger social and environmental contexts. Having read and studied natural representation in many other media, and I think Paul was alluding to this, literature, painting, photography, film, and so on, I was shocked that game studies, the sort of academic field of studying games, was still obsessing over questions like whether or not games are stories or art, or whether or not game mechanics or narratives were more essential to their gameness. And it's not to say that these weren't or aren't valuable questions, but I personally was disappointed that we weren't evaluating terms like realism, immersion, interactivity, and world building, so often associated with games, against decades, if not centuries, of work on how nature has been perceived, portrayed, captured, and interrogated. And this could be in many areas, but some of the ones I think of are religion, biology, geography, physics, documentary studies, site-specific art, and I'm sure you could come up with many more. So I was determined to start with this counterintuitive premise that nature and technology are not necessarily mutually exclusive realms, even if that made it feel sometimes like I was constantly fighting a rearguard action against common sense notions of the natural and the technological. Okay, here, this is kind of my worst slide ever. I'm sorry. The table of contents of my book. I just wanted to show you, since I don't have time to go into all these concepts that I deploy as a heuristic in playing nature. I just want to say that at base, what I wanted to get at was what I felt is a fundamental similarity between what scientists do and what game players do, namely fiddle with a predefined system and try to figure out how it works. In fact, the scientific term mesocosm, which is the title, as you can see, of my first chapter, refers to the kinds of experimental enclosures created by scientists that are somewhere between the full complexity of reality and the very strict, simplified conditions of laboratory setups. And these are some images from the book. On the left are 12 floating outdoor marine mesocosms in Western Norway, run by the University of Bergen Mesocosm Center. And on the right, you can see via drone footage, this 10-hectare forest fragment at the Amazon Biodiversity Center in Brazil, at the research reserve, where scientists for decades have been studying the effects of man-made edges, generally produced by burning or deforestation, and the impacts of that fragmentation on forest health. And what they found is that there are some species that actually thrive at these zones of disruption at the edges of deforestation, but there are others that are highly sensitive to that disruption and have to sort of flee to the interior of the natural fragment. And in science, there's this kind of debate over the structure of forest reserves and whether it makes sense to have a single really large reserve or many smaller ones. And so these are the kinds of scientific debates and thought processes I was trying to capture in that chapter. And to be clear, when I'm talking about the similarities between gameplay and scientific work, I'm not just saying that it's the people who make games that are like scientists designing experiments, but also that it's the people who play games who are engaged in the same spirit of experimentation. And this systems orientation that's kind of integral to ecology informs other chapters of the book, from how games excel at forcing players to change scalar perspectives, to the many ways that games dramatize systemic breakdown and collapse. And so on the scalar side, you know, I don't actually write about this game in the book, but it's one that I think of now. The game Everything by David O'Reilly, who also created the game Mountain and the video game segments from Spike Jonze's Her. And in this game, which is narrated by a physicist, you can scale way down to the level of like pollen or atoms. And you can also scale way up to the level of galaxies and beyond. And when we talk about systemic breakdown and collapse, there are scads of kind of post-apocalyptic games. I just would bring up this image from an older game from Ubisoft called From Dust, where you have to regularly defend your tribespeople from fire, flood, and other elemental disasters. So even though ecology is right there in the subtitle of my book, by the time I finished writing, I really could feel that ecology wasn't always enough to explain the ways in which games produce deep emotional connections to virtual organisms and places, something that's more parallel to an environmentalist ethic than a scientific one. In the book, I talk about games that aren't just generic fantasies, but arise from meaningful attachments to real-world places like Firewatch and Walden, which I've already talked about, and the text game Adventure, which was based on the Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky. I also draw on a range of work from psychology and other social sciences about how, as humans, we're somewhat hardwired to care for non-human others. And also how our childhood experiences with nature, both mediated and unmediated, impact our adult environmentalism or lack thereof. And you know, what I found is some of the most powerful affects come out of these things that ask us to care for them. While researchers like Sherry Turkle at MIT have long studied people's engagement with dolls, animate toys, and sociable robots, I find much the same thing going on in games, where there is a robust catalog of games where you play as animals or even geologic features. In the book, I think I mentioned the game. It's just really like a smartphone app called Viridi, where all you do is take care of a pot of succulents, occasionally water them and weed the pot and sing to them. There's also the Swedish studio Might and Delight's Shelter 2 and Meadow, which are games where you play in the role of an animal mother. The first game being an animal badger, and the second a mother lynx. And Meadow being an animal MMORPG where you're all interacting as animals in this persistent world. But today I wanted to highlight this particular game. I'll get to it in a second. That came to my attention after serving as a mentor for the Indiecade Climate Game Jam in April of this year. This is just my badge that I was given for a recent session we did about recapping the game jam. And incidentally, this picture, this kind of cartoon version of me was created by some of my former students when I used to teach at University of Connecticut. So the fun thing about teaching games and game design is that I often get these like animated versions of myself showing up as cameos and stuff. So, and then if you're not familiar with what a game jam is, it's a pretty intense, some would say brutal, organized event where you get together, usually in a shared physical location. And this is pre-COVID. And you meet up with these other people to try to make a game from scratch within just a few days. And many developers use this as a way to spark their creativity or just force themselves to create a certain number of titles in a year. And the Climate Game Jam was somewhat atypical in that the participants, well, first of all, were doing this remotely, and they were given 5 whole days from a Saturday through a Wednesday to make their games. And in game jam time, that's actually quite a lot. Indiecade is the premier independent games festival organizer, and one that is much more inclusive than other games-related professional organizations. And for this event, they partnered with Seattle Indies and Games for Our Future to host a climate change-related jam. And I think it's worth quoting at length their stated reasons for putting this event on, even in the middle of the pandemic. So why we jam? Now more than ever, Indiecade is focused on supporting creativity, connection, and hope for the future. We invite game creators from across the world to join Climate Jam to explore solutions that can address a rapidly changing world. The goals for the jam are to take action and raise solutions. We believe this generation of creators care deeply for our planet and holds the power to inspire while using games as a platform. And then the final paragraph, at this moment, it is all the more relevant to think about people, nature, and resilience in the face of global crises. We have this moment to explore how new and different kinds of relationships between people and nature might build the resilience we need to withstand and reverse major global calamities such as climate change, pandemics, and economic downturns. So to sort of give you a sense of the non-human gameplay that arose in this particular context, this is one entry that didn't win an award, but I think is an excellent example of non-human gameplay by the Asian American game designer Mike Wren. It's called Night Flyer, A Bat's Journey. You can see it was developed in Unity and is available to play as a web-based game. And I'm just showing you a video of one of my playthroughs. So you start as this young bat eating fruit and then moths, so you're omnivorous. And very quickly, you go from being a young bat to a teenage bat, kind of having a good time, eating all the cereal in the house. and then at some point, you become an adult bat and you're charged with finding a bat partner. And for a while, everything is looking pretty good, you're enjoying life. And then this ominous bulldozer appears in the background. And unfortunately, you can't hear the music, but the music is also well done. It has this retro aesthetic. And eventually, the bulldozer actually comes into the first rank of trees in the foreground. And you realize as a player that your time is short, right? That your food sources are disappearing along with your habitat. And so you reach this pretty poignant ending where your mate falls to the ground. You sort of last a little while longer. I was debating, do I stay with my mate or do I go try to eat another moth? By the time I decided to go try to eat another moth, it was too late for me. And this ending, which is basically unavoidable, is followed by a short cutscene, which you'll see in a second. In which kind of an unidentified man appears with a cage, puts you in it, loads you up on the truck. And this is the kind of interesting part, is like there's a very obvious sneeze. And so Mike Wren is definitely trying to think about the sort of animal to human transmission, origins of the coronavirus, but I think is also trying to think less in terms of scapegoating the species than thinking about humans' intrusion into natural spaces as being the large cause of the kind of calamity that we're facing, right? And there's a sort of option to learn more about bats and do more after this. So, clearly there are emotions at play in these kinds of games. They're also there when we lose cherished places. Researchers have actually shown that adult environmentalism is often driven by childhood attachment to places that are later lost or destroyed, right? Like they pave paradise and put up a parking lot. And in my book, I talk at length about how these attachments to place, or what geographer Yi-Fu Tuan called topophilia, can occur in game worlds. When the massively multiplayer online game World of Warcraft released its third expansion entitled Cataclysm, many players who had been with the game's fantasy world from the very beginning felt a great sense of sadness at how the original landscapes of the game were being dramatically overhauled for the sake of narrative progression. And as the name suggests, Cataclysm featured global upheaval with a supernatural origin, the dragon Deathwing, but which was clearly meant to be read environmentally, because changes included mountaintop removal, cyclones, forest fires, eruptions, earthquakes, and sea level rise. Zones which had been deserts became oceans, green oases burned to a crisp. And I have a few examples here. So this image is actually of an alliance town called Meniful Harbor, in the wetland zone, and it's already quite close to the sort of sea level line, as you can see, and this is pre-Cataclysm. And then after Cataclysm, this is what it looked like. So the water's coming right up to the central keep. The docks are basically in shambles. You can see from a distance, the bridge is also washed out. And another zone, which is sort of known for its natural beauty, was in the sort of night elf zone of Darkshore, and this is the town of Aberdeen. And they have a very vaguely sort of Shintoist aesthetic, which people have noted. So this is what it looked like pre-Cataclysm, and this is what it looked like post-Cataclysm, with all the structures destroyed. And the zone, which is heavily forested, largely burned. And even though it's impossible to pin the dramatic decline in WoW's subscriber numbers after the release of Cataclysm to the remaking of the game's world, I think it's worth considering. And also thinking about how popular the re-release of so-called vanilla WoW, which just means the original WoW, which happened more recently, may have been for these very reasons. And this also bears on how similar attachments to place in the real world often keep us from more practical decisions like moving out of flood zones or the urban wildland interface, which is prone to these fire flood cycles. Okay, I could say a lot more and certainly would love your questions in the Q&A about sort of game ecology, ecology in games, but I want to turn now to the second part of the talk, which is less about the content of games than about the games industry and the role of game hardware and software in the increasingly outsized carbon footprint of people like me, well-off, largely Western consumers. And this kind of work belongs with other pioneering studies that have been done on the growing environmental impacts of film and media production more broadly. things like Nadia Bozak's The Cinematic Footprint, Hunter Vaughn's Hit Hollywood's Dirtiest Secret, Maxwell and Miller's Screening the Media, and this very recent book, Sean Covit's Finite Media. And in game studies, the go-to for a political economic study of games has long been this book, Nick Dyer-Witherford and Greg DePoyter's Games of Empire, which I should say was recently revisited in an article in the Journal of Games and Culture. The essay is called Politics of Production, Video Games 10 Years After Games of Empire. It was written by Emil Hammer, Lars de Wilt, Suvik Mukherjee, and Caroline Pelletier. But there are others worth mentioning, which I rely on in my book. James Newman's Best Before, Video Games, Supersession, and Obsolescence, and Ray Ginz's Game After, a Cultural Study of Video Game Afterlife. And these are really fabulous if you're interested at all in games and media archaeology, game history, and these kind of questions of industry rhetoric. Newman does a great job of unpacking how the video game industry completely relies on this relentless upgrading and sort of rhetoric of newness. And Ray Ginz has a lot of great detail to sort of the afterlives of games and game hardware, most famously the sort of legendary story of Atari's dumping of millions of unsold cartridges for the game E.T. in the 80s in a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico, which for a long time was sort of unverified and just sort of speculation, but then eventually they found it and unearthed it, and the town of Alamogordo actually auctioned a bunch of them on eBay and helped their town budget immensely. So in film and media studies, we have names for these kinds of analyses. When we're attentive to conditions of production and distribution, behind the scenes labor, structures of ownership, policymaking, regulation, and so on, we are doing media industries work. When we radically expand what a medium is, to think about not just content, but context, about geopolitics, energy use, infrastructure, waste, obsolescence, and so on, we are in the newly labeled realm of environmental media studies. And in the last couple of years alone, we have two new journals, the Journal of Environmental Media and Media and Environment. I'm involved with both of them, but it's the latter one that Paul mentioned that I actually helped to start and still co-edit with Janet Walker and Adriana Baki. And Media and Environment is importantly open access, which means all of the work is freely available and it's not behind a sort of library firewall. We've deliberately made it highly interdisciplinary with contributions from scholars, scientists, artists, and activists. And there's very much baked in a commitment to social and environmental justice and a public humanities model where we academics don't just kind of hunker down in our ivory towers, but we're trying to share our knowledge and engage in debates about things that concern all of us. And I should say, you know, we have a couple of great issues, what we call streams up there already, but we also have ones that are in the pipeline that are very exciting. One about modeling the Pacific, and another one about energy justice in global perspectives. So look forward to that, and I invite you to visit mediaenviron.org and just read some of these pieces, some of which are very short. But to return to the ecology of games, it might interest you to know that the materials that go into game hardware have been implicated in years of armed conflict, like the so-called PlayStation War, which spanned over a decade, 8 African nations, and 25 militias, at the center of which was mining for coltan, a metallic ore that winds up in many electronics, including the PlayStation. And today, there's more talk of cobalt and lithium, particularly for electric vehicle batteries. And this image is of a mining operation in Kolwezi, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A great deal has also been written about electronic or e-waste, including how much of it travels from the so-called first world to the third world for recycling or processing that typically involves really hazardous conditions. And this is an iconic photograph from Edward Bertinsky of a Chinese woman who's processing like motherboards and these kind of toxic components on her front doorstep in China. Many others have been writing about data centers, those anonymous looking buildings that often are built near rivers or in colder climates that house thousands upon thousands of servers for internet and cloud service companies like Facebook, Amazon Web Services, or Google. And this one happens to be a Google data center in Finland. So I think what I'm trying to get across is that many of us have been lulled into thinking that using the cloud or Wi-Fi or even mobile devices must be better for the planet than buying and shipping hard copies of things like DVDs, CDs, or wired networks or clunky desktop computers. But it turns out when you start to try to dig into the science that those calculations aren't that simple. Some film and media scholars, for example, have started to work with engineers to determine the carbon footprint of, say, streaming video on-demand services like Hulu, right, or Amazon Prime. Laura Marks, in an article in Media and Environment, in fact, asks us to think twice about streaming a juicy clip at the highest resolution possible, or at the least, to do so like we'd order and consume a pricey steak at a restaurant, recognizing it as the resource-intensive culmination of unsustainable land and energy practices. Others, like Lucas Hildebrand, argue that we should resist asking our students to just watch required movies or even play games at home, because watching and playing collectively is not only better for the way that we learn, but also in terms of energy consumption. And I want to point out that arguing that things are getting more efficient all the time doesn't really get us that far either, as there's always Jevons paradox, which is named for the English economist who noticed many, many years ago that the English consumed far more coal after the invention of the more efficient steam engine. And so Jevons paradox really names this phenomenon of efficiency breeds greater consumption. And I would argue that this cradle to grave approach to media isn't just an optional way to study media if you're interested in the environment, but that it's something essential to any approach to media. Just like it matters that many productions that supposedly take place in the US are actually being filmed in Canada or New Zealand in so-called runaway productions, or as Benjamin Bratton has written, that we all carry bits of Africa around in our pocket if we own any kind of smart device. It matters too that Nintendo, as we've already discussed, whose family-friendly games like Animal Crossing often trade on associations with nature and wholesomeness, initially came in dead last on Greenpeace's Guide to Greener Electronics. And it's really funny if you go dig a little deeper and you look at the individual report card for Nintendo in that year, whoever the Greenpeace writer was that was doing this was having a fun time, I think, because they write, Nintendo scored a 0 out of 10, leaving infinite room for future improvements. Okay, so just to begin to wrap up, I want to pose a few questions. First, what do I want you to take away from this talk? Is there anything that you can do about the state of affairs to make games more sustainable, both inside and out? And how do we take something like Sean Cubbett's provocation in finite media, that even communicating oneself with nature, for instance, by filming a nature documentary or making a serious game about the environment, necessarily implies damaging it? And I don't have easy answers, but I will say as a teacher, I do believe that it's important to build awareness. So if we want to talk about what media literacy looks like in the 21st century, we have to include games. If we want to understand how cultures around the globe are dealing with the environmental crises of our current moment, we have to include games. Purely from a numbers perspective, games generate billions and billions of dollars of revenue worldwide and occupy far more of our time and attention than traditional television now does. And I can give you some of these numbers on revenue. And I do think it's really interesting. I'm teaching a grad seminar right now where we're talking about streaming and television and new media. And I always tell people that the Netflix CEO, Reed Hastings, once said in a shareholder letter that the popular battle royale game Fortnite was actually more of a threat to Netflix's profits than something like Time Warner's HBO. So there's a really interesting media ecosystem going on. I will say some concrete steps are being taken in the industry. So following the climate summit in New York last year, the United Nations launched the Playing for the Planet initiative, which is an alliance of game companies publicly committing to certain sustainability goals. So on the left, you can see the companies that are currently involved, some very notable ones like Unity. I would shout out to Eline Media, which is the native-owned publisher who distributed Never Alone and more recently Beyond Blue. And probably the most famous of these goals was put out by Microsoft, this idea that Microsoft will be carbon negative by the year 2030. In addition to that, the International Game Developers Association, or IGDA, has also started a Climate Special Interest Group, or SIG, which states as its goals that it aims to establish grassroots climate councils at every major game company and, quote, amplify the UN Environment Programme's message about youth advocacy, the power of video games, the climate crisis, and what games can do, end quote. And I actually participated in one of their initial workshops, which was led by Paula Esquadra, who works at Google Stadia and is one of the volunteer leaders of the SIG. And we basically tried to brainstorm categories and tangible action items in areas ranging from development to outreach. And it's things like everything from promoting less graphically intensive games to establishing an external watchdog organization or trying to set industry-wide benchmarks for sustainability. And I will say also that the SIG is open to participation at all levels. And if you're passionate about this topic or even just interested, you can go to this, this URL and fill out the contact form that is at the bottom and join us. It's very much happening right now, and it's a chance to sort of make a difference in this area. But last but not least, I do want to loop back to the first part of the talk where we were thinking more about game content and form. And I think I'm obviously someone who believes in the power of media representation and environmental storytelling in games. Like Thoreau's writing or Batinsky's photographs or Norwegian slow TV, games help us to make sense of the world, which might involve wonder, fear, speculation, meditation, empathy, and even mourning. And I should say that this is another indicated Climate Jam winner, My Fair Planet by Seth Paxton and Ben Ash. It's a very simple sort of almost like Tamagotchi-like sim where you're caring for a little planet and trying to vacuum up pollution and take care of things. And it's actually quite difficult and becomes exponentially more difficult if you don't take actions very early on. And they sort of left that in to really, I guess, trigger players to think about, climate action in the real world and how we make things exponentially more difficult for ourselves when we don't actually take action early on. I happen to live in California, where this year we had the worst wildfire season on record. And this year was hardly an anomaly. These are stats from CAL FIRE. 8 of the 10 largest fires in California history have burned in the past decade. Both the massive August complex fires and the more recent Creek Fire became the largest fires in the state's history. So as a last example, I found it strangely appropriate that the grand jury winner at this year's Climate Jam went to a game called Fire Season by Max Loy. And the only setting that you can manipulate at the beginning is your level of funding, which controls how many firefighter squads you have. And because I didn't want to make life difficult, I gave myself high funding on this run through. And so I just kind of cut together some of this run through that I did. where you can deploy these firefighting squads, and there's you can see that the fires are realistically somewhat contained by natural features like water or mountain ranges. You can also zoom in and zoom out to get different scalar perspectives. And your goal is
I think I might have.
Oh.
I think I might have missed it. Is this like a actual simulation, or is it? I can't think of the word.
Oh, no, it's not using real data. Is that what you mean?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, no, it's just
curious.
it's just a simulation of with this, you know, made up mechanics. But I will say, in the upper right hand corner is this weather vane, which shows wind direction. So that's one of the things. And I kind of cut to about 4 or 5 minutes into my play on this level. And you can see that I was not doing a very good job. You will see, yeah. So when that—
Yeah, that's a lot of fire.
When the fire spread fills up the bar, you get this awesome, the flames consume all, catastrophic failure in the first season in my case. So not super impressive gameplay. Don't judge me. But I just find that this really simple game, which was created in 5 days, was both cathartic and also very humbling for me. It's just a very few mechanics: fire spread, wind, and fire containment. You know, with these few mechanics, Loy really created this compelling, intense experience. And in this video clip, you don't hear the audio at all, but at the start of the game, you hear a very low kind of fire crackling in the background. And by the end, when the flames are sort of spread all over the map, the sound of flame burning is practically roaring in your ears. Okay, so just to say in sum, I want to say that solutions to climate change and all these multiplying environmental disasters lie both in changing our media representations, but also in protest, politics, policy, sacrifice, and science. And to that, I would also add 2 things: care and play. Care for each other, care for the species we share the world with, care for the places we call home, and play because there's still a great deal of joy to be had in what we have now, especially if we make access and equity and sustainability a priority. Thank you. And these are ways to contact me if you want to, on social media or email.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Chang. I'm giving you virtual claps here. We have time for Q&A, and I'm more than happy to let this be fairly informal. So you can raise your hand. You could just simply unmute as long as you're not speaking over someone else, or you can add a question in the chat. Yeah, so let's just open the floor for some conversation and responses.
So is there like some data on how higher powered graphics games will like what kind of an environmental effect that has, like compared to like lower graphic powered ones?
Yeah, I don't have it right at hand. I think if you go to the IGDA SIG page, actually, I'll pull it up. And I don't know, I think this is still really like a new area that people are trying to wrap their heads around and create like calculators, and there are a lot of debates. There was one out of actually a PhD dissertation out of New Zealand that actually was pretty hopeful about the efficiencies that are being created now and that things are getting better. But again, there's that Jevons paradox thing. But I think on the climate SIG, it says, well, it's not about graphics. It says video game playing consumes a staggering 75 billion watts every year, the equivalent of over 2 million cars.
Wow.
So you can see how this gets really tricky fast, right?
Yeah.
But it's, but there are questions worth asking. And it's not to like berate people for playing beautiful games, right? I still want to do that too, but it's to do it sort of thoughtfully and not to sort of, take for granted our ability to do that when other people don't have that ability,
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, there's a podcast. Yeah. And Rayford Gins, there's an article version of the of his historian's take on the ET landfill thing, which is called Concrete and Clay. It's like in memoriam something for ET. It's a really great article, but it was written before they actually found the site of the cartridges and dug it up. So it's a much more speculative kind of exercise. Anyway, but
Yeah,
it's a great.
This particular episode starts with them at the dig, so it's fun because it has the energy of the like, will the game cartridges actually be there? But then it goes into the backstory of how this whole thing even happened to begin with. This is the first time I'd heard about it, but yeah, but the ecology of it is really tangible, at least in the sense you can hear these trucks, like.
Oh yeah.
So
There's some video footage, and it's so funny because the designer of this game, which was universally panned for being awful because it was super glitchy and ET kept getting stuck in these pits, and it was just like, the game they printed like 5 million cartridges and only sold 1 to 1.5 million. It's unclear. But the original designer Howard Scott Warshaw was there when they excavated it. He was actually kind of like proud. I mean, to be fair, I think, he was only given like 6 weeks to make this game or something like that because it was a tie-in to the movie. But, it's just funny. And now, these cartridges, if you look on eBay, they go for sometimes like up to like hundreds of dollars for a piece of trash, right?
Yeah, it's interesting how relics turn out like that, to be nearly worthless when they happen and then nearly priceless years later.
Right, but does that mean that we're all going to be like paying $400 for NBA 2K and like?
No,
I don't think so.
Absolutely not. No one would.
Doesn't NBA 2K already cost $400 to play?
I hope.
I hit a
I
nerve.
swear.
It looks like Cindy Frankel has a question.
Well, first of all, I'm so delighted to be here. This was absolutely fascinating. I teach creative writing for video gamers at Lawrence Tech.
Oh, wow. That's so great.
And this week, we had the curator she's a physicist who was from the Science Museum in Detroit. And so we're seeing how they pair up with Detroit Public Schools with video games and what students can do to match up their skills with future employment too. The thing that I loved about your presentation was how wide-ranging it was. And my question for you is if you know any books that would be useful for me in addition to yours about because this
I know, should I have a book?
My background is writing and literature. I'm a poet and an essayist. So this is a whole different thing for me. And I am finding it such a pleasure how wide-ranging video games are and how interconnected, because I look at holistic versions of teaching and scaffolding through holistic views. And that's why I loved your lecture so much.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I should also say I come from a literature background. So
I'll email you.
Okay, great.
The way you traversed everything was exactly how I teach. I just loved how inclusive it was.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that because sometimes I feel a little bit like nutty, but I think I am kind of medium agnostic because I started out in literature, very much about creative nonfiction and Shakespeare and all sorts of different things. And then sort of traveled my way through film studies and then new media studies, and then wrote this book about games. And also all the while being very interested in science as well as the humanities. I did bio as well as film and English undergrad. So if you all are wondering what produces this kind of complex.
Change through video games, because I see this worldwide community that I so am fascinated by with my students.
Mm-hmm. There's a whole strain of scholarship about games and literature and the sort of relationship between interactivity in games and things like interactive fiction. So, there are many things. And I will say, since you're teaching that class, I haven't actually done a lot of writing for games. My brother did. And it's kind of sad that writing takes a backseat, just like art assets often take a backseat to the sort of mechanical design of the game's function. My brother once wrote the game manual for a Bethesda Softworks game that was basically disappeared. They're famous for all these games like Fallout, but there was a series, the Elder Scrolls Arena series, and there was yeah, I actually worked for them in my summer after high school as a tech support. And I'm dating myself, but that was back in the day when I had to teach people how to make boot disks because computer memory wasn't large enough to actually run games. So you had to like trick your computer into running these games with the aid of an external disk, or like
I remember boot disks.
Modifying the config.sys or autoexec.bat files. Yeah, DOS. So, but you know, he wrote this manual, and it was funny because you're trying to create this like fantasy lore world. And then at some point, you know, an executive comes in and says, we can't do shields. Shields are gone. Cut it. Right. So you're like trying to write this narrative and be compelling, and then because of these other factors, you know, it's just gone.
Yeah, I feel like the writing is incredibly important in video games.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain studios that specialize in that, right? Like Tale of Tales or The Walking Dead kind of stuff, right? Other questions? I also will happily take suggestions for things I should look at.
Go ahead, Franco. You need to unmute though, I think.
Yeah, this was wonderful, Alenda. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this a lot.
Thank you.
I recently taught a course in psychology of video games, and there is this concept of how do you say that? I'm bad in English. It's a new term that includes entertainment and education. Is
edutainment?
Yes, edutainment.
It's a terrible word, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So there is this neuroscientist that work a lot at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Now is in the University of Geneva in Europe, in Switzerland, and she talks about the chocolate-coated broccoli, right? Talking about video games, right? Because as the
sounds gross.
It sounds gross, but it is actually. But you know, video games are irresistible like chocolate, but useful in her view like broccoli, right? Because, for example, she did a lot of studies about the speed of reaction, attention, and a lot of things in actually shooting games, action video games that are so often demonized. And so she really did studies publishing in Nature Science, really high-level publication on very basic kind of cognitive processing enhancement. Now, my question for you is, do you think that this involvement of, I'm referring to the first part of your talk, especially. So you talk about the fact that we can be sensitized about problems in ecology. And I really believe that, or actually to consider nature using the medium of video games, which is a very active thing, is not only requiring you to kind of passively receive contents, but you are actually interacting with the concepts that you are dealing with. Do you think that this is, what's your take on this broccoli chocolate thing, especially in the environmentalist kind of declination of the concept?
Thank you, Franco. That's a great question. It brings to mind the term gamification, which has been like a lightning rod in game studies. I can't say it on Zoom, but Ian Bogost has written about this. I'll say that and what he thinks it is. I still think that the reason why games could be so powerful in teaching ecology and environmental interaction is because they're so engaging. And to sort of strip that away and focus on the didactic function would be sort of missing the affordances of the medium. So I think you still need to create compelling games, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be graphically sophisticated, right? I find really simple games compelling when there's something about the way the system is working that surprises me. And it could just be a text game or a very simple graphic game. And I think, I'm always torn between these media influence models, right? I don't believe in the sort of hypodermic model where, watch media, use media, and then it sort of just has this direct effect on you, right? Which was the sort of argument that critics have made about games and video game violence, right? But I do believe in the sort of more nuanced media influence model where it's, even playing these games that are in the magic circle or whatever, still have some influence on the way that you perceive things or what you perceive as possible about your interactions in the world, or even just creating a sort of emotional mood. And I think you also sort of reminded me both in studies in like positive psychology and flow that sort of pertain to games, and also studies that have been done about visual exposure to natural environments. And I think a lot of that stuff, all these studies, the journalism just sort of tends to translate it as like going outside into nature is really good for you, right? Go take a walk. And then they often don't read the science very well and see that actually the participants in the study were just being shown images of natural environments, right? Because what person has the ability to take all the study participants out to nature? And like so some studies have been done like that, and this goes back to very famous like hospital studies where they looked at the improved health outcomes of patients who had rooms where the window faced greenery, like a garden, rather than a brick wall or like another patient's window, right? And so I guess I don't know if I really answered the sort of gamification question. I don't think you could just slap games on everything and make it palatable, like the chocolate covered broccoli, right? And I think that would sort of, in some ways, like steal what makes games powerful from it. And I think maybe I can ask people to look at an upcoming book by Patrick Jagoda, who's at Chicago. And he has a book called, I think it's Experimental Games, and we're doing an event in January about it. And he's really thinking about gamification and about neoliberalism and how, in some respects, games feel like they're part of that complex. But then he's trying to excavate this also kind of like other part that's similar to what I say about games and experimentation, that's tied more to like performance studies and performance theory and alternate reality games and these other kinds of like interactions. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know. I would encourage you to go read Ian Bogoss' Atlantic article about gamification.
Alenda, do you know if that event you mentioned in January, will that be an online event?
Yes, it is. I think it's being coordinated by the press. So yeah, I'll probably put information about it out.
That'd be
on
awesome.
Twitter.
Advertise it here because I know there'll be the folks who came out here will be interested in participating in more of those conversations. I think we have time for one more question, and then we probably need to wrap it up. Is there any more questions?
I'll go.
Oh, hi, Joy.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for that really great talk. I, like you, am a media studies scholar who started with literature and then went on to film, but I'm still on film. So I don't know much about studies except for a little bit in like the feminist studies realm. And I'm just wondering, how big is kind of ecofeminism in game studies right now? And then also in terms of the actual creators of these games that you were showing us, is there more room for like women and girl creators in this new world of kind of like eco game making?
Yeah, that's great. By the way, I should also say I don't mean to imply that there's like a teleology, like progressive, like we all need to evolve out of literature into like new media. It's fine to stay at film or whatever. Yeah, that's really great. I think we're lucky because we live in an era of really easy to access game making tools, as you all know, like Game Maker and even Unity and things like Twine. And there's a really thriving sort of small, more artistic indie game scene where a lot of people who traditionally wouldn't have been enfranchised by the games industry have been able to create portfolios. And I think of like the work of people like Kara Stone, who makes very much like ecofeminist work. But actually, maybe I would redirect that to a lot of work that's been done recently around queer games and queer avant-garde games. And then there's a whole body of scholarship that goes with that in queer game studies by folks like Bo Ruberg and Whitney Powell and Chris Patterson, Tara Fickle. There's a bunch of folks that are sort of involved with this. And I think there's actually sort of a link between the ways that I'm trying to get people to think about games differently and to play games differently and to make games differently. And those folks who are interested in kind of seeing games and play as a way to battle like heteronormativity or chrononormativity. and you know, actually walking simulators is like one of the points of contact, right? Because it's like, here's a way of playing queerly when you like slow down and don't progress at the time pace that the game asks you to progress at, right? When you go really fast or really slow. Or when, you know, your goal is to do one thing and you pick an entirely different goal, like in Burnout Paradise, I don't know, try driving really carefully and according to the law, right? So these kinds of things, I think this is where it's really exciting. And I don't know about and access for women and girls. I do think Gamergate was a sort of watershed moment that probably drove a lot of people away, which is really sad.
Right.
And that we all sort of have this responsibility to sort of just remind people that games aren't really a subculture anymore. Like I'm used to thinking of it as a subculture because of how old I am and like what it was when I was young, but it's not. It's totally mainstream now.
Yeah.
And so we all have to be equipped as, you know, teachers, educators, parents, peers, whatever, to not just like be content to let games exist in this other zone with its own rules and its toxic culture and just like actually shine a light on it.
You're here.
Yeah.
Well, that was a wonderful note to end on, a call to transformation. So thank you again, Dr. Chang, for joining us. This was wonderful. I'm thrilled to have all of you here with us today. If you can, we have an audience survey that we ask everyone to fill out. It only takes about 5 minutes of your time. It really helps us get a sense of future events and the kind of interest that people have. Please come back to join us in December for Mars Hicks' lecture. We'll be posting more information about that. And we will also have a recording of this event available on our website in the coming week or so, which I hope people will share and send to their friends and spread the word for those who weren't able to join us today. But it was really nice to just have 2 hours in this very intense week to just sit and hear some wonderful work. So thank you again for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Franco.
Of course. Yeah, it was great to have you. I'm glad it all worked out. You know, one of the cool things about this is that we at least get to hopefully, you know, bring in a wider audience beyond just like the physical space of LTU, but we still largely have LTU students and faculty and staff who were in the audience, so which was great. And we did an event last spring with Jamie Madigan, who wrote a book called, I think he's written a couple books on video gaming. He's a psychologist, and that event had a huge turnout. So we decided that this needs to be another kind of, we need to keep working game studies, which is great. And then what you were talking about with environmental media studies was really exciting for me to hear about, because we just developed this new undergraduate degree called Technological Humanities. And what we're trying to do is give students different paths where they can develop some hard tech skills, but then also have like a broader liberal arts education. So we have game art and we have they've changed. We have 2 video game related degrees here, and then we also have a number of design and architecture degrees. And so I think that would be a really fascinating path for some of the students to take up questions like sustainability and so on and so forth through media, like how it's made and how it's circulated. So
yeah, we're trying to create those positions. So
yeah. Well, and our thought
will
is,
exist in a little bit.
Yeah, and our thought is like a student might be able to then go on and contribute different perspectives to industry itself, right? So we want like people in industry who are working with that kind of background. So
I think they are really interested. I was pretty shocked to find out that people at Google Stadia were familiar with my work already. So
that's great.
That's
awesome.
Good. You know, stuff is they're thinking about it too. So anyway, all right, I'm gonna go check on my kid.